In 1938, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed into law the Fair Labor Standards Act, which did a lot of things, but chief of most, it put into practice for the first time in our nation's history a federal minimum wage at a rate of 25 cents per hour. So how should business owners interact, talk about, and utilize the minimum wage in a 2023 context? Let's get into it. Do not let any calamity howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry. That is a quote from FDR in 1938 after the FLSA was signed into practice. And what he was going after was some pretty harsh political rhetoric that talked about how executives would be pushing against this minimum wage. And what he's arguing is that the executive is making $1,000 a day in his story here, and workers are making $11 a week. So he's telling people, don't let, the millionaires of the world tell you that we shouldn't have a minimum wage. And that, my friends, is the discussion that we're going to have today. How does minimum wage work in the context of a small business specifically? There's a lot more broader application to this topic when we get into subjects of corporations and international companies. But for today's show, for today's purpose, I want to talk about this in the scope of a small business. So in order to know where we're going and how to articulate a debate, we need to understand where we've been, what the history tells us. So let's get into a little bit of history about the minimum wage. So since being enacted in 1938, the minimum wage has increased federally 23 times. It's currently set at a rate of $7.25 per hour. And for a fun fact, if you ever want to whip this out as a party trick, there are 5 states that don't have a minimum wage on their books, so they default to the federal. Now, there's a lot of variations in this, and because of that, what I'm trying to demonstrate here is how deep of a subject this is, but we want to treat it very superficially sometimes. We want really poignant headlines, buzzwords. We want to say things that resonate deeply with people to try and get them sparked up and outraged and mobilized. But we need to understand the complexity of a topic before we can dive into trying to solve it. And like all things, there are extremes. There are polar opposites on both ends, and usually the answer falls somewhere in the middle. So for example, when we talk about minimum wage, you can have minimum wage set at a city level, a state level, and a federal level. So for example, in Seattle, the minimum wage is currently $16.69 per hour for employers that have more than 500 employees. In California, for the state, if you have more than 26 employees, it's $14 an hour. And if you have less than 26 employees, it's $13 per hour. And here, as we're sitting in Michigan right now, our state minimum wage is rated at $9.87 per hour. And what I want to do is tell a bit of a story about what $9.87 per hour looks like for a single person. And that looks like about $21,000 per year. And the poverty line in Michigan currently is set at roughly $13,000 per year. I'm using rounded numbers. If we want to get into the actual details of the math, which I don't think is as important as the concepts we're pulling away here, we can certainly do that. But again, the minimum wage in Michigan right now is set at roughly $21,000 per year. The poverty line in Michigan is $13,000 per year. A 1-bedroom apartment on average is $846 per month, with Detroit being called out on the low end of $764 and cities like Ann Arbor on the higher end, nearing $1,400 per month. And if you were to put this person, this individual into a budget, you would say, they're making on the net about $1,500 per month, and their rent is roughly half of that, a little bit more, which leaves, $600-700 a month for all the other things. So at this point in the discussion, you might be thinking, you might be on one extreme or the other of this particular debate. You might be saying, that's ridiculous that someone can pay someone that little and expect them to live and have any livelihood. Or you might be saying, well, that is a reasonable starting wage for somebody in the workforce, but it's not a wage meant for them to stay there. It's a starting wage, not an ending wage. And you also might be in the middle of the debate, which, as I said, is where a lot of people also fall. It's important not to think about extremes in debates and actually deal with the data. So I've laid out where we're at, where we've started, where we've arrived at in terms of the federal minimum wage. And now what I want to talk about is how other individuals look at this philosophy, and then comment on a more micro context of what we're doing here at Wayne Media for this and what I think other business owners, specifically small business owners, ought to do. So Johnny, go ahead and play clip 1, if you don't mind.
We've seen Walmart, for example, and some other companies follow in its footsteps, raising what they will pay their entry-level workers up to $10 by 2016. Last year, when I asked you, Warren, if the federal minimum wage should be raised from $7.25 an hour, you said that is the toughest question you could ask me because I've been thinking about it for 50 years and I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
And your reason for that is because you don't know if more people will be better off because you do lose some employment.
I know if you increase it to $20, I'd like to see everybody make $20 an hour at a minimum. But I know if you increase it to $20 an hour, you'd have millions of people unemployed. I don't know how to calibrate it precisely. I personally believe that the earned income tax credit is a much better way of handling the problem of people who are really not paid enough to live decently. And the earned income tax credit accounted for $57 billion, $56 or $7 billion in 2013. Mm-hmm. I would expand that a lot, and I would do it smarter too. But I think that's more effective in helping the people who are really at the lower end than actually a change in the minimum wage.
Why should people care about income inequality?
Well, I think that we live in a country that has $54,000 of GDP per capita, and it's the richest country in the world, and a miracle in many ways. And real GDP is 6 times what it was per capita when I was born, but all kinds of people are left behind. And there are some structural reasons for that, and I think that a rich family takes care of the people that aren't born with a particular wiring that enables them to prosper mightily in a market economy. And there's lots of people that they fight in Afghanistan, they do all, they, through no fault of their own, their skills are not skills that the market values highly. And I think that a rich society, a very rich society, can figure out ways to have those people do better than they are doing.
So there we have Warren Buffett, one of the most intelligent, prolific investors in our nation's history, talking about a very complex topic. And where did he land? He said it's a very big issue, and there's not one right or wrong answer. And there's several trade-offs that you have to think about if you raise the minimum wage, or conversely, if you leave it as where it is right now. And what I want you to do is think about that for a minute. Here you have someone who is a billionaire, one of the wealthiest people in our country, noting things that there are structural issues in our economy. Our GDP per capita has raised 6 times since he was born, so probably 80 years ago. So our country is getting wealthier and wealthier, and yet there are some people left behind. Now, just the mere mention of that might make people freak out and say, well, you got to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, you got to do this and that. And that's not what we're saying here to do or not to do. And what I'm saying is that it's okay to acknowledge that there are some structural issues in our economy that cause people to get left behind. And when we identify those things, we need to be able to say, okay, let's fix this. Let's try and address it the best that we can and move on. It's not a weakness to say, oh, we have problems in our economy where some people get left behind. That's not a weakness at all. If anything, it's a strength in identifying that we have something here that we can fix. It's an opportunity to address something that a lot of people, frankly, don't want to admit. And notice this whole debate, I've not given this whole conversation, rather, it's not a debate as I'm just one person. But this whole conversation, I haven't yet given you my position on this because I really want to do a good job of laying the foundation of what I think are some of the most important things to think about as we go into the debate. Now, there's been a lot of proposed solutions to this. And in this next clip that I want to play here, it's more of a local broadcast, but they articulate a couple of things that Congress could do to help alleviate this. So let's go ahead and play that, and then I'll react to it.
Okay, Rob, before you get ready to go any further, I got one question.
Sure.
So, one, the definition of GDP, and why is that important to the average person if we have a $54,000 per person GDP.
Yeah, so GDP, gross domestic product. So basically what that is the amount of revenue that our country earns from imports, exports. Is basically the business of our nation. And the reason why it's important to note, and some small effect to this discussion, is because it's raised so much over the last century, which tells us that us as a country, we're getting wealthier and wealthier, which means in a lot of people's eyes, that means we can do a much better job of redistribution of wealth to make sure that people don't get left behind inside the economy.
Excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
Are you ready for the clip?
Yeah, let's do it.
Fight for 15 has started up again on Capitol Hill, this time in Congress's latest COVID relief package. In the House of Representatives, the COVID relief bill includes a hike from the current $7.25 an hour to $15 an hour by 2025. But in the Senate, that's a non-starter.
Economists will love to tell you there's no such thing as a free lunch, and that's the same thing with the minimum wage.
I talked to Jason Fichtner, an economist from the Bipartisan Policy Center, and I wanted to know, what's the big deal with raising the minimum wage?
Everything has trade-offs and opportunity cost.
First, the positives. At $15 an hour, the lowest salary an American could earn would be $31,000 a year. The Congressional Budget Office, the nonpartisan economic arm of Congress, reports it would increase wages for 17 million Americans.
That's a lot of people you'd help. You'd also minimize and reduce poverty by almost 1 million people. The CBO says 900,000. But nothing's free.
And here's the trade-off. The CBO also projects that at least 1.4 million Americans would lose their jobs as a result and would likely not be hired again.
But the higher you make the minimum wage, the greater the incentive it is for an employer to find ways to automate to save money.
That's where the Senate isn't sold on $15 an hour. But like all things on Capitol Hill, if Congress looks for it, there is a middle ground.
Well, one of the things that comes to minimum wage is that it has not been pegged to inflation.
And if Congress tied minimum wage to inflation, that would increase it to $10 or $11 an hour. And according to the CBO, that would raise pay for around 5 million Americans. Job losses would be considerably less, around 400,000. Not the huge splash the House wanted to make, but an impact with less damaging trade-offs.
So this is what's frustrating about politics in general. So there's a lot of different rabbit trails we could depart on in that newscast that we just listened to. The one I want to talk about is the data that they had given. So just stay with me for a minute here. So if we increased, and these are all estimations, projections from economists, and they try and stay, they try and stay in the middle. They don't want economists that are very left-leaning, very right-leaning. They want to stay in the middle. So there's bipartisanship, right? Or nonpartisan. There's no one on either side. So if we take the estimation that they had given us, 17 million people would receive raises if minimum wage was increased to $15 per hour, and 1.4 million people would lose their job, right? Now they said, okay, that's a lot, right? So what if we compromised and we did it based on inflation? So when inflation goes up, wages go up. Okay, let's take a look at that. 5 million people would receive wage increases and only 400,000 people would lose jobs. Now let's do some really simple math here, all right? What's 5 million times 3? 15 million. What's 400,000 times 3? 1.2 million. That is damn near the same number as if you raised wages to a $15 minimum wage. It's the exact same thing. It's just at scale. So when you look at compromise, it's going to affect on ratio the exact same number of people if you do it on inflation as if you do it through a flat rate of $15 minimum wage. So the compromise that they're proposing here is the exact same thing, but just scaled down, which means there is no real compromise. We're just talking about the number of people it's going to affect on both ends. It's essentially the exact same thing, which to me tells us that we don't really have a solution. We're just trying to minimize or mitigate the damage or the effect of what we're doing when we talk about raising the federal minimum wage. Now, to me, there's a lot of economic factors at stake here, and there's a lot of philosophies that float around, and it gets people very heated. And one thing I know for certain is that there's no one plan that exists that's going to make everybody on every side of the debate very happy. So what do I recommend? Let's get into what does Rob think we ought to do about this? And to me, there's one word as an umbrella that can really help this situation. That's advocacy, which is a very popular buzzword, but what are we actually advocating for? So to me, there's three things that we ought to ask of our small business owners as they're considering what they pay people. Now, if we were to line up government solutions on one end and free market solutions on the other end, this idea that I'm going to propose is going to lean much more towards the free market, because I don't believe the government, even if we have the absolute best leaders in the game in those positions, I don't think they could solve this problem and make everyone on all ends happy. But I do think there is a micro solution, if you will, to helping this out on a small business level that could potentially spread. So what are the three things that business owners need to consider? The first thing is business owners need to consider the cost of living when hiring a position, and they need to implement a company minimum wage that has a why behind it. Business owners need to put themselves in an employee's shoes and consider their perspective when making a job offer. And third, business owners should not minimize the value of personal financial wellness benefits for employees. So let's look at that first one a little bit more closely. So why is it important for a business owner to have reasoning behind a company minimum wage? And I would guess, and again, this is just my opinion, that a lot of business owners, especially small business owners, haven't put a lot of thought into what their company minimum wage ought to be, right? They might have a range and they might base it on, they have someone come in and they're a younger kid, and then they're, because of that scale goes down. They don't really have a lot of thought behind it. And what I would be encouraging here is understand exactly what your minimum as a company is and why that is. And for me at Wayne Media, we've raised ours once since we've started. So that our company minimum wage was $15 an hour when we started, and it went up to $17 right after COVID. And largely that had to do with cost of living increases and inflation and things that I thought would be relevant for our industry to move our floor up, so to speak. And the why behind it is I want to be able to sleep knowing that the employee at our company who makes the least is making a good living. They're not in poverty. They're not, they don't have to ride the struggle bus, so to speak. That's what I base our why on, is I want to feel confident in what we're paying the employee who makes the least amount of money. Business owners need to understand that. They need to define it, think about it, and have a reasoning, put it in your HR manual, whether that's internal facing or forward facing, whatever that is, you need to have that why down. Number two, business owners need to put themselves in employees' shoes and consider the job offer from their perspective. This is more of a mental exercise and just understanding like, okay, I've offered you $10 an hour. Is that reasonable? You have to consider the work, the job, the scope, the person, the industry, the marketplace. Is that reasonable? Can you live with that? Again, that defaults to the why. Why are you doing it in the first place? But you need to have that thought exercise down to make sure you can justify what you're offering somebody. And number three, this is one that I want to bring as much attention to as possible. The number one reason that employees lack productivity is due to financial stress. There are, of course, other factors that go into that, but the top reason is financial stress. And the cost of personal financial wellness benefits, like we just rolled out Smart Dollar here at Wayne Media, and we were comping the Every Dollar program up until we've rolled this program out. But I have really put a focus on financial wellness benefits for employees because I know that employees that have less financial stress are better producing employees. It helps out in their personal life, which translates over into how they approach their professional life. So don't underestimate the power of those financial wellness benefits. You might not be in a position when you started your company to offer health and dental and vision and a 401k, but you can offer benefits that help at least start to turn your employees' personal lives around financially. There's always a really good starting point for you to embark on. And I think raising awareness on the value of tools like this are extremely, extremely important. So what do we do here at Wayne Media? I want to give an actual practical concept of what we do at the company, and I'll tell you if we had it when we started or not. I think that'll be a good exercise here. So our full stack of benefits right now include medical, dental, vision, 401k with a 3% match, personal financial wellness tools, and personal finance consulting and advising. Now, when we started, we did not have the 401k, and we did not have a formal financial wellness program. We did trainings and, lunch and learns and things like that on the value of personal financial wellness, and we comped an application for budgeting for our employees, but we didn't have that formalized, and we didn't have the 401k. But from the beginning, I wanted to make sure that when I could hire someone full-time, I could both afford what I thought was reasonable to pay that person and their benefits. Because to me, healthcare is so expensive. It's ridiculous how much healthcare premiums are. And I wanted to be able to budget in at least half of those premiums for that employee to be able to bring them on so they would have decent benefits and a decent starting wage. And for me, and I'm talking about me here, that's what I needed in order to start my company. So I built my business model around that. And that's where I think a lot of people go awry, is you might start a company and you might have a donut shop and you might say, I'm going to sell all my donuts at the lowest prices in town. It's 25 cents a donut or whatever it is. And then you get into the part of, okay, I need labor. How little can I pay my labor in order to make that happen? And that's the wrong way to think about it. I started with the employees first. What should we pay our workforce as the company scales? And how do we build our products and services around that? And that's where a lot of companies in my industry, marketing, go wrong, is they're going to offer social media and creative services at the lowest price possible. We don't do that. We are not the lowest price in town. We are probably the most expensive in town. But with that comes, in my opinion, the best damn creative team that you can get, because that's how the company was built. Premium people that are paid really well, in my assessment, and they love coming to work across the board. All of that factors into your business. How you pay people, how well you take care of them, how well they treat your customers, and how well your business grows. You can't isolate one thing on an island like wages and say, and one of my biggest frustrations right now is when I hear employers say, everyone is just so lazy. No one wants to work. Well, no one wants to work for you. That's what we're talking about here. No one wants to work for you because of the business and culture that you've set up. And that might be a hard pill to swallow. And there might be other underlying factors that are going into that. So I'm not saying it's just that. But if you haven't done a really hard and long look at your human resources department and you're still having problems hiring and acquiring new talent, that's the first place you should start, is with yourself. Look in the mirror, look at why your company exists. Why do you do what you do? Why do you pay people what you pay them? And if you can justify and articulate that, then move on to the next thing. It's not just one thing that goes into this. And that's the whole point of this podcast today, is I've probably read 25 different statistics. We've listened to, in my opinion, one of the best investment minds ever. And no one can solve this topic with just a couple of lines of rhetoric. This is a very complex recipe with a lot of complex ingredients. And you can't just hold up one thing and say it's this, it's the left, it's the right, it's greedy business owners, it's lazy people. It's none of that. And in some aspects, it's all of that. But it's not just one thing. And the whole purpose of this podcast is understanding why business owners ought to do the things they should. And it all comes down to justification. Can you explain why you do the things that you do? Or is it just based on a whim? Is it based on an initial feeling? If that's how you operate your business, you're not going to have a business to operate much longer. And if you're an entrepreneur, if you're getting started in the game, these are important things to think about at the front end. And trust me, you're not going to think about all of them. You're not going to be able to know all of the grenades and landmines that are going to come your way as you start a company. I certainly didn't. And I'm still learning every single day. Every day, I learn a new thing that I say to myself, damn, why didn't I know that before? Why didn't I think about that before? But the point is, how do you recover from that? How do you learn? How do you grow? How do you adapt? And this topic of minimum wage, it's very infuriating to a lot of people because they say, businesses should be able to pay more. But at the same time, some businesses weren't set up to pay more from the beginning. So you have to recognize that causing businesses to raise their minimum wage will make people exit the workforce. Then you have to say, is that a good enough reason to do it? Is it okay to have people exit the workforce? Is it okay for those businesses to embrace AI and automation to make up for that labor gap? Again, complex problems, complex solutions. But on the ground, as a small business owner, you can recognize that with what you're doing inside of your four walls as a business, that you can justify it, you can own it, and you know exactly why you're doing it. So what are a few things that are not helpful for this debate? And I've talked about this pretty much throughout the show, but things that aren't helpful are throwaway rhetorical lines. And I see these in headlines all the time, and you can find them, just search, YouTube street debate on minimum wage, and you'll find, the man on the street going up and asking people about this, and they give their one rhetorical line. And what I've seen, and these are direct quotes, is if minimum wage is $15 per hour, how much will a cheeseburger at McDonald's cost? Yeah, it's a fine question, but it's not a statement. You're not adding anything to the debate unless you finish that thought. Number two, minimum wage is meant for people starting in the workforce. They should be glad to earn that wage. Well, the fact of the matter is 50% of minimum wage earners are over the age of 25. So I understand that sentiment. I understand the idea of it being a starting wage to get people into the workforce. But what are we doing beyond that to make sure people are advancing through the workforce? Again, not a necessarily helpful thought on an island.
All right, Rob. So I want to interject for a second.
Yeah.
That's an outrageous number that I bet you no one would ever guess.
Yeah.
Age 25, minimum wage.
Yeah.
Right? Crazy.
Yeah. And as I was looking at it, and again, if you Google this statistic, I went with the most reputable one. I've seen it at 40%, 45%, 60%. I've seen it right around that mark. But yeah, it's not as though 100% of the workforce that's earning minimum wage is 18. That means we're in the right direction.
Yeah, that'd be exactly what you were thinking. A start-off job,
Yes.
Not a guy that's 25.
Exactly.
Wow.
Exactly. And the third one is that I don't think is helpful is asserting that the government doesn't have a role in minimum wage. Now, this I understand is controversial because there's a lot of people that say, well, the market can take care of this, and if the government just got out of the way, the market can correct this. Maybe. I haven't seen any evidence of that. The government needs to have some role in setting a floor, I believe. And we referenced FDR at the top of the show, and I want to talk about this interaction that happened during one of his campaigns for re-election. A young girl tried to pass him an envelope, but a policeman threw the envelope back at her, and FDR said, "Give me the note from that girl." And he read the note, and her note said, "I wish you could do something to help us girls. We've been working in a sewing factory, and up to a few months ago, we were getting our minimum pay of $11 a week. Today, 200 of us girls have been cut down to $4 and $5 and $6 a week." And the reporter asked FDR the question, something has to be done about the elimination of child labor and long hours and starvation wages. What are you going to do? And in those broad aspects, I do think the government should play a role in making sure that there are guardrails for businesses. Child labor, right? Requiring people to work 60, 70 hours a week, right? I do think there should be a minimum wage floor, although I think it should be set at a state level based on, the geographical location and just industry for each state. For example, cost of living in Detroit is a little bit different than the cost of living in Seattle, Washington. So those things need to be taken into consideration. But my point still stands that the free market cannot be the only solution. I think it can play a major role, no doubt. But I do think there needs to be some government assistance in providing those guardrails. And maybe you disagree with me. Maybe you're like, no, Rob, here's how it can go down and here's how it can work. But I'll tell you this, if your comment is is not at least a page long, then that solution will not work. Because if it was as simple as opening up a fortune cookie and solving this problem, I promise you it would have been done a long time ago. So, last thing. I want business owners, and we're going to dive into this into a future episode of employee retention, because this is a fascinating topic. If employers thought more about retention, I do believe that they'd be more willing to pay people more. And let me give you a few statistics. So in general terms, across the board, it costs about 65% of an employee's annual salary to replace them, right? So if you have an employee making $12 per hour and you turn that position over 3 times in any given year, that's about $16,000 per new hire that you're spending, or roughly $48,000 per year. Have you hired that person on at, say, $16 per hour, you would have incurred an added expense of about $10,000 per year, but you would have avoided the $48,000 that go along with the hidden cost of rehiring. Now you might be saying, well, Rob, that's crazy. How can it possibly cost that much money to rehire someone? And what I tell business owners all the time when I consult with them on HR strategy is you need to think about how much it costs to pull key people away to train, how much your bandwidth as a business suffers because you can't take in new business because you're constantly in a rehiring cycle, and also how much having less tenured people in your workforce is affecting your overall culture, which again contributes to the overall wellness of your organization. So there are a lot of hidden costs with rehiring and turnover that you don't necessarily think about. So you could have paid that person $16 an hour and your business would have been better off for it. But you're not in that long-term mindset. You're very much looking at the monthly P&Ls and deciding how less or how cheap you can pay someone and still remain profitable. You're not thinking about the long-term picture. But that, I think, is a topic for another day. So final 2 segments to wrap this up. Number 1, the quote of the week comes from one of my biggest business influences, Jocko Willink. If you haven't read the book Extreme Ownership, I highly recommend you do so. And the quote is, "Don't expect to be motivated every day to get out there and make things happen. You won't be. Don't count on motivation, count on discipline." And my couple takeaway thoughts on that is a disciplined business is synonymous with a healthy business. And that includes a strategy for your workforce that goes beyond how can I pay people the least amount possible. That is not a strategy. And lastly, one of my all-time favorite Proverbs, Proverbs 3:27 through 28, it says, "Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due, when it is in your power to do it. Don't say to your neighbor, go and come again tomorrow. Tomorrow I will give it," when you actually have it with you. And that's powerful. If you have the ability to help and contribute and be there for someone in that moment, do it. Don't just put it off. There's zero reason to do that. And that, to me, if the more you think about that particular proverb, and we'll make sure it's linked in the show notes, the more you'll understand the application to this very broad topic of minimum wage. So that is going to wrap up episode 2 of Theory of Why. I appreciate you all listening. I want to thank our major sponsor, Key Bank, for all that they do to help us keep the lights on here at the studio for this podcast. It means a lot. Apart from that, we will catch you on next week's episode, everyone. Hope you enjoyed the show. Take care.